Okay, very good. Thanks for having me. Thanks for reaching out to talk about code reviews. This is a topic that's near and dear to my heart, mainly because I do it on a daily basis. There is so much code that's out there, and we as both security professionals and developers should be reviewing our code on a somewhat regular basis with other people for specific reasons, right? Smart Bear has all sorts of data on doing code reviews. If you've never seen their website, please go take a look and see what they have to say about it, because it's very instructive as far as how we should approach code reviews, how we should sit down together, how we should talk about code, think about code, and not make it antagonistic, right? That's the one thing that we don't want to do when it comes to what functionally is going on within code. But the quote that I've got here, code review is the act of consciously and systematically convening with one's fellow programmers to check each other's code for mistakes. It seems fairly straightforward. I don't know how many people actually do this in a group setting. Large organizations, I see it quite a bit. For those of you that didn't read my bio, I'm a consultant that does application security, anything in the SDLC, ranging from developer training to code reviews, obviously, to all sorts of other things. But a couple of years ago, Ken Johnson and I sat down. We host Absolute AppSec. It's another security podcast, but we host it. We sat down and got to thinking about the number of manual code reviews that we do from a security perspective. And the fact that there wasn't good instruction or a good methodology that was out there to help us figure out how to do this sort of a code review. There's a lot of good resources when you are sitting down and functionally looking at code, figuring out what your teammates did, what other developers did, how to analyze that, how much code you should look at. But the approaches that we have been taking for the last 15 to 20 years, when we're looking at code from a security, with a security bent, change what a code review looks like, right? So we started to think about a secure code review in a different manner than what you traditionally think of as a code review, a functional code review, integrated code review, peer code review, however you want to think about it. But we really key off of this, right? That we check each other's codes for mistake. And there's nothing that developers love more is when someone else reviews their code and tells them that it's wrong. Of course, right? I'm being a little facetious there. But the whole idea is that we want to raise the level of security that is in our code all around, across the board. And to do that, we have to have some way to look at the code from a security perspective. And it's not just, opening up the code base, spotting the bug, right? Like, this is very difficult to look at. Obviously, this is minimized JavaScript, and it's going to be very difficult to figure out anything here. But we do have a tendency to jump straight down the rabbit hole, right? Especially as security reviewers, if we're thinking about security concepts, we think about SQL injection. We skip back to this specific code base that we're looking at, start looking for where clauses and select clauses, and forget this fact that we only have a limited amount of time to find the most impactful security bugs with the code that we are looking at. And so we also forget the fact that this statement from Smart Bear goes back to, hey, secure code review, or code review in general, is this act of consciously and systematically convening and systematically looking at source code for those bugs. We don't want to jump down the rabbit hole too quickly, especially if we don't understand what's going on with the code base. I've been pulled into a lot of code reviews where I have no idea what this pull request was for, why this new feature has been developed, what the application actually does. And so you have to have a systematic approach to breaking down an application to understand, number one, what the code is doing, but number two, and probably most important in a secure code review, what the risks and threat that is involved with the code that's been developed actually is. If you don't understand what that risk profile of the code base actually looks like, there's no way that you can do a secure code review. There's no way that you can do a bunch of other security aspects, but especially a secure code review. Like, there might be an application that doesn't care about authentication, right? Like, we just it's all public. And so looking for usernames and passwords in that code base doesn't make sense. But we go down these rabbit holes because, hey, we like SQL injection. Hey, we like these authentication issues. But if we don't understand what the application is, it's actually going to be detrimental to finding bugs in that code base. And that's what we've discovered over the years. The quicker that we jump down those rabbit holes, the actual worse job we do at reviewing code. And so that's where we want to back up. We want to have some sort of an alternative to just a list of vulnerabilities that we go check off a list, so that we can have the most impact and the most proper code response to the code base that we're looking at. So the alternative that we're looking at here is something that, this Absolute AppSec, code review framework, whatever you want to call it, the philosophy behind it is that we're not trying to find every single bug imaginable. We're not trying to find all of these vulnerabilities. We're trying to have the most impact by focusing on what matters, being as comprehensive as possible, but also taking into account that we only have a limited amount of time with this code. As a consultant, I'm doing a secure code review. I've probably got a couple weeks within a code base, but I'm looking at tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lines of code. And there's no way that I can look at 100 to 200 lines of code per hour and get through that entire code base. So I've got to focus on what's important. I've got to focus. I've got to be able to distill down what that application actually does quickly in order to find these vulnerabilities and turn it over to the developers in a easily consumable format. So what does that actually look like? We're coming up with this repeatable systematic approach. We've got to make sure that it suits your own philosophy, your own approach to looking at bugs and what you know about security. So in short, and I know I'm already running low on time, we have a full course that we teach on this, and there's multiple different documents that are out there, but the Absolute AppSec framework goes through these 7 steps. Right? This is realistically what it boils down to. You get in a room, you open a file, you take notes. Right? If we don't document it, the effort is wasted. Get to know the application. We've got to know what it does, how it does it. We map it out, and then we think about those risks. Number 4, like I've said before, this is crucial in figuring out what an application does and determining what security risks are involved with it. We build out a list of review items. This is where that approach comes in, your expertise. You already know about authentication vulnerabilities. You know how identity should work. You know what SQL injection looks like in Django or whatever language that you're using. You can build out those review items and you can look at the code for those aspects. But you've got to get to know the application first. Those steps, 1 through 4 there, are non-negotiable when it comes to code reviews. If you're stepping into a room, you don't know that information yet, and you're doing some sort of a pair code review with someone else, those are the first questions that you ask. Now, if that's too much for you, right, blah, 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 the TLDR on this is write stuff down. What's the app doing? How's it doing it? And what could go wrong? Answer those questions first. If you can answer those questions, it's really easy to determine what should I look at. How does that, what in the code base is interesting to me from a security perspective, and then go do it. And if you've got more time, wash, rinse, repeat. You just repeat the process. You start again to say, do I still know what the app is doing? Maybe I discovered something when I was looking at it that changed the aspect, that changed what could go wrong. And so I want to do this process 3, 4, 5 times in order to perform a good secure code review. From a general principles perspective, right? Like we've got all these ideas, like we can build the code, we can run the test, we can look at different places, but realistically, don't make it personal, right? Like let's not attack people for developing secure code. Usually that's just a lack of knowledge, that's a lack of experience. Just because you can see it in the code base doesn't mean that there weren't other considerations that the developers had at the time that they were developing that code base. But the methodology overall, right, it's those questions, that repeatable process. If we look at it as we start to break it down, and there are, like I said, if you are interested in this, please contact me on Twitter, ask questions in the chat. I can provide you with the PDF of a full-blown document that goes through all of this. But again, this is the TLDR on it. Realistically, you do some sort of overview, you do information gathering, you create those checklists, and then the checklist should cover at the very least the common security pillars that we look at. So AAA, authentication, authorization, auditing / accounting, right? Who are you? what can you do? What did you do? And then the CIA triad as well: confidentiality, integrity, availability. That's where these other ones fall, these injection vulnerabilities, cryptography. I mean, you can go look at the OWASP top 10. There is an OWASP Open Web Application Security Project. They have a secure code review methodology as well. It's more focused on specific code and code snippets, Java, JavaScript, and other things. We've taken a more holistic approach so that you can look at any code base as long as you're able to read code. Realistically, though, when you're diving into different portions, and I'll step through a couple of these here. Like I said, if there are questions, we'll take them here shortly. But the first thing you want to do is build a portrait of the application, right? This is what I go back to: getting to know the application, what it does, how it does it, what the map looks like, and then what the risks are that are associated with it. You build a profile, the behavior of what it actually does. You create a map, something like this, how it processes its logic, how it responds to the user, how it presents data, how it does some sort of authorization. That's really important when it comes to security. Maybe your application isn't involved with that, but at the very least, there should be some sort of authorization or some sort of checks that are involved there. And then we look at those authorization functions to make sure they are tied in properly. But you've got to get to know what those are before you actually analyze the code base. Otherwise, it's very difficult. And then you perform, you build your checklists, each of these different items. Like I said before, the CIA triad, the AAA, those will help guide you in this process. And, rinse and repeat. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's determine what the actual risks of that application are and dig into it. But along those lines, right? And I'm actually through the presentation, but let's go back to the list of questions, right? Or the blah, blah, blah TLDR, because this is really what it comes down to. Are you actually writing stuff down? Do you know what's wrong with the application or what could go wrong with the application? It's one thing to realize what the nuances and the framework nuances are with JavaScript or Go or the framework that you are targeting, but it's another thing to recognize the risks involved with each of those different nuances and whether or not it actually applies to the code base you're looking at. Developers going to jump back at you if they run into issues or they see things in your findings that aren't necessarily applicable because there is no risk that's there. And I've had this happen to me on a personal level multiple times where I call something out that I think is a critical risk vulnerability, but because I didn't do the research, because I didn't spend the time profiling the risks to that application, it was actually rejected or ended up being a low risk finding or a non-issue when it came to the business itself. So I know that's a lot and I've been talking, but again, like I said, if you've got any questions, you can find me on Twitter at Seth Law. You can also find us at Absolute AppSec, and the Secure Developer Podcast is also great for these sorts of topics. And yeah, anyway, so there you go. There's my 15 minutes. Go do code reviews. I know they can be hard, especially from a manual perspective, but they are definitely worth it.
Thank you so much, Seth. And I can confirm that Sam may have done a fist bump when you mentioned the Secure Developer Podcast.
Yes, that's good. Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions, but we thought we'd quickly ask you at least one of them. So one of the chewy ones that I thought we'd ask is from Magno, who says, what do you do when there is no documentation for the app and the code is the documentation?
Ooh, that's a good one. Magno, thank you for that. When there's no documentation for the app, I start from my generic list, right? But I will still jump straight into trying to distill down what the application is. And having no documentation, especially a lot of, how do I say this kindly? A lot of startups that I run into, the code is the documentation. This is a very common problem. And so being able to distill down, all right, I know, and I can go look at like what the requirements.txt file are for, Python, or what packages.json look like. It gives me a pretty good idea of the different the different subsystems that are being pulled in or libraries that are being pulled into an application, which also gives me an idea of what the risks are that are associated with it. But one of my favorite things to do when there's no documentation is to get those developers on the horn, right? Whether that's a Slack channel or a conference call, and just ask them straight up, what are the risks that you're concerned about? What are you trying to prevent? Like, how have you thought about security? Just asking a couple of those questions will usually answer enough that I can start digging into the code. Like mapping out an application, there's a whole art to that. You'll get better at it over time, but be willing to ask those questions. You don't have to do it all on your own. Just because you have a code base doesn't mean that you have to figure out everything that's going on. Use those developers because they know what it is, right? It's their secret sauce, what have you, and ask the question.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Do we have time for another?
I think we have time.
Yeah, we have enough time for another question. So again, Magno has fired up another one for you. So any scripts or tools besides SAS that are helpful during a code review of large code bases?
Ooh, I mean, besides the developer IDE, this is one of the recommendations that I always have is use the IDE that the developers are using, because it's going to make your life easier when you're doing the code review. I mean, it's very common, to try and just pull everything up in Atom or Visual Studio Code. But, that's the first thing. Besides the SAST tools, I mean, my favorite recently is semgrep from r2c.dev. Those guys have a great, it is kind of a SAS tool. It's a semantic grep that they do on the code bases. It's very, it helps actually distill it down to, file by file. They do a lot of detection of common vulnerabilities. It's more of a stopgap for me, though. Otherwise, I'm probably looking at developer tools that help map out endpoints, right? Tell me all the routes that are in an application so that I don't have to do that by hand. That'll help speed things up. I'm thinking rake routes for Rails or Django's, show URLs. There's a couple others that are out there for .NET and Java. But otherwise, I hate to say it, but it's manual, so it's hard, right? Like there's no getting around that, especially on those large code bases. I wish it was easier, but it definitely isn't.
Everyone loves the sound of manual.
Yes.
It's far too advanced for us. Well, thank you so much for your talk here, Seth, and also thank you for answering these questions as well. Like I said, if you want to ask Seth any more questions, feel free to drop them into Hopin or grab them on Twitter or in the DevSecCon Slack. But thank you again, Seth. And
all right.
We will hopefully
thank you so much
from you soon.
Yes, thanks so much, Seth.